Is going to be moderated by our own Jen Giuliano, who's a professor here at USC and also the director of the Metrans Transportation Center. And I will let Jen introduce her panelists, and hopefully we'll continue having our good conversations.
All right. Welcome everybody to the first afternoon session. As you heard, my name is Jen Giuliano and I am the moderator. So all I have to do is keep these unruly people in line. We're going to talk about congestion pricing and road pricing, I think, more generally. And we're going to talk about this with particular attention to the issues of equity and social equity in pricing. What I want to do first is introduce the panel, and I have to my immediate right Lisa Schweitzer, who, by the way, was the organizer of the event today, I think, right? So you can thank her for all of her wonderful ideas that you're going to hear about. She miraculously did not put her own bio into this board, but that doesn't stop me. Lisa is a newly minted associate professor. That is to say, she was awarded tenure a few weeks ago here at SPPD. She teaches in the planning and policy programs in the school. She was formerly at Virginia Tech, so she's been with us for roughly 3 years. And she got her degree, I'm sorry to say, at UCLA. And one of her committee members is on this very panel. Who have I got next? Stephanie, right? Yes. Okay, Stephanie. Stephanie is from the LAMTA, which I believe is officially LA Metro, right? Okay. Executive Officer and Program Director of the LA County Congestion Reduction Initiative. I don't know how many people know about this project, but there is a plan to actually convert the HOV lanes on the 10 and the 110 to actual hot lanes, high occupancy toll lanes, and that plan is moving forward. She has over 16 years experience working in transportation agencies, including the Riverside County Transportation Commission. And she is an alum from USC. She has an MBA from USC. Next is Ken Small from UC Irvine. I'm not sure Ken needs any introduction, but why not? He's a professor emeritus of economics at the University of California, Irvine. I can say that he is one of the most well-known and well-respected transportation economists in not just the United States, but internationally. He has written extensively on just about every topic of transportation economics you can think of, including a lot of writing on pricing, the effects of pricing, and I think a few papers on the equity and distributional aspects of pricing, if my memory serves me adequately. He was honored in 1999 with the Distinguished Member Award by the Transport and Public Utilities Group of the American Economic Association, and the Distinguished Transportation Research Award from the Transportation Research Forum. He's also a fellow of RASI, the Regional Science International. So, not only that, I always tell him that he's the person who taught me whatever economics I actually know. Okay, Brian Taylor, UCLA. Brian Taylor's area is transportation policy and planning. He's done a lot of work on sort of the policy side of transportation finance. He wrote one of my favorite book chapters in the book that I edited on with Susan Hansen. He wrote it on transportation finance, and I recommend that book chapter to all of you. He has had experience at the metropolitan planning level, right, the MTC, and you got your degree at Berkeley, is that right?
Berkeley and UCLA.
Berkeley and UCLA, okay. He actually is now chair of the department at UCLA, so he is learning about how you no longer have time to do anything because you're always in meetings. So he's done a lot of work on various aspects of travel and transportation behavior. Okay, so that's our illustrious panel. I'm going to start by sort of asking some basic questions, sort of the way things went this morning. And I think it's really important to start out by getting on the table why we should price roads in the first place, and what's so good about it. And because literally Ken has written a book on this topic, I'm going to ask Ken to start with sort of a primer on why we should price roads.
My accomplishments keeps getting magnified. Is this on? I can't tell from where I am sitting. I've written books, but I don't know exactly. Not a whole book on this one subject.
He's actually going to start levitating.
Yes. The simple answer is to reduce congestion. The more complicated answer is because it appears it's the only policy that will actually reduce congestion in a sustained way over a long period of time, at least with anything that's feasible in terms of, say, tax rates or amount of public service that public transit service that you can afford to put in. Economists like it because it is efficient in the sense that although it costs people one thing, they get something else back. Not always the same people. So I mean, that goes into the equity question, which I won't just do all of myself. But I mean, Tony Downs, for example, when many people have looked at whether just reorienting land use would be enough to eliminate congestion, or reduce it to manageable levels. And he's very pessimistic. He spins out scenarios, and he knows real estate really well, where you alter development patterns in a way to reduce congestion, and it takes so much, and the difficulty, especially in the United States, of doing that is so great that he really says this is not a policy for congestion, it might be for something else. And then I think it also has very interesting interactions with public transit, which maybe I'll get into, but there's another question later. Is that enough to get us started?
That's enough to get us started. So let's talk a little bit about the topic of this conference, which is the equity side. One of the big criticisms of congestion pricing is that, in fact, it will have negative effects on those who cannot pay the fee. So we hear the term of Lexus Lane and all of this stuff. Is it possible to address the social equity problems in congestion pricing? And I'll let anybody who wishes to start this one.
Yes, you can certainly address them, and you'll never satisfy everyone. The Lexus Lane has proven to be a bit of an overstatement. That is to say, that the hot lanes that exist in the U.S., which are about 4 or 5 at present in different parts of the United States, have attracted a broad group of people, not just people who can afford a Lexus, but they also, it is true, they do tend to attract higher income people, as you would expect. There are various programs that have been proposed to address it, some directly through like rebates or there's a fare program that the Federal Highway Administration has been advocating under Orla Souza, who's in charge of the congestion pricing demonstration program there, where you give people accounts and they can use these accounts for their congestion fees. So that's one way to reduce payments. Other people talk about other policies that you could tie with congestion pricing to try to redress, or let's say rebalance the effects on different groups. It could have to do with public transit provision. It could have to do with reducing certain taxes that are now regressive. It could even be direct income transfers, although I think it's probably not very practical at the local level.
draw a distinction. The Lexus lane discussion comes up over high occupancy toll lanes, which is the strategy of having an optional lane that people can buy into versus having lanes that are free and sort of congest as they do or as they don't, versus the equity impacts of a across-the-board congestion tolling scheme. And one of the things that we know about in the United States at the levels that we're at is that there's some fairly good evidence that you get a lot of congestion reduction benefits simply with hot lanes. And then as time moves on, I think moving towards full congestion pricing of the entire facility would then have to be ramped up in order to continue to realize those gains. But when you think about tolls that people can volunteer into to get a premium service, that's a lot different than sort of a toll that you need in order to use the facility at all. And so there are many people who argue essentially that hot lanes themselves, depending on where the revenues go and depending on whether road space is taken away and all sorts of other things, are a priori reasonable. I mean, it's a fee-for-service kind of thing where you pay and you get something out of it, you directly benefit from it. And you know, the people who are willing to wait it out in the free lanes are happy to get rid of you, right? Bye-bye. Whereas with congestion tolling, the question is a little bit different. And it's interesting that we have a lot of equity discussions about congestion tolling, but we don't really have the same sort of equity discussions around highway tolling in general. And there's a lot of just basic highway tolls in the United States. There's tolls that you have to pay to use many major highways that aren't congested, for example, in Oklahoma. And you sort of look at that and ask whether that's fair or unfair. And then you look at those different regimes and figure out that, you know, in Oklahoma they may have higher tolls to use the highways, but they have very, very low gas taxes. And so people end up paying about the same as they do everywhere else. And so these things, I'm sort of complicating the picture quite a bit, largely because it is complicated, and that we don't really want to be talking about these payments or these tolls as equal or equivalent financing tolls, because they're not.
I'd like to pursue a little bit. Who actually, given that we do have some examples both in this country and outside this country of something close to congestion pricing in one form or another, what do we know about who actually who actually pays the toll? Who are the people who actually pay the toll?
The toll payers.
Do they have certain attributes?
Well, it's hard not to offer another snarky response. I mean, just
Lighter pockets.
Yes, they're traveling. Well, I don't want to answer that question. I want to answer one before we get to it. You posed this as a question about social equity, and I think that Stephanie or others that will be dealing with this is that equity issues arise in many ways around these topics. I mean, where the project should go in one area relative to another, who are the various stakeholders involved. Some of it has to do with socioeconomic factors. Some of it has to do with geographic factors about where people are and who pays and who benefits. Some of it has to do with interjurisdictional rivalries about fairness. So that one of the things I think that's most fascinating about these particular projects is how much and how intensely concerns about equity arise in them relative to many. They arise in many other kinds of projects and programs we do, but they arise most strongly. And I've had conversations with Stephanie about this, that elected officials, I think, very sincerely have a high degree of anxiety about some unfairness in this. But I've been sort of struck at how, on one hand, how sincere it seems and how poorly articulated it is, that there's this general sense that somebody's losing out here and that they sincerely want to see that not be dealt with. But the fact that itself, the concept is somewhat abstract, I think it makes it very difficult for elected officials to kind of work through the process in a way that helps them arise at some level of comfort. And I think that might be because of the so many ways that equity is defined in the context of these sorts of lanes, and also just a general status quo bias that we tend to think about change and its relative distributional impacts much more than we do in the current situation. So I think that you framed it kind of right away as social equity, and I think it's really important. I think that there's a lot of other concerns about is San Gabriel Valley having too much of this put on them, or are they not getting enough? Those are huge factors that are influencing these debates as well. I don't know if Stephanie may have anything to that, but I think the question you asked is a good one, but I just wanted to make that point.
I would agree with you completely, Brian, and I think there's also the sense of freeways are free. So whenever you're introducing price for a service that people think they haven't paid for, there's a real reluctance and a concern initially about pricing. It's a huge issue, and we've had to deal with all forms of equity, geographic equity, market equity, social equity. And that sort of brings up the larger issue of what the policy debate actually is on these kinds of projects. We've had many examples of proposals failing. For example, the New York proposal failed. So, in terms of a New York case, I don't know how many people know the details here, but when we kind of look at the policy debates on failures about what we consider social equity considerations, that is to say, or the distributional considerations of who actually would end up paying the toll, and is it that sort of a burden, or is it more about the kinds of equities that Brian has just identified?
We had asked about who was paying the toll. I think that if we look at the New York case, I think there's some interesting parallels with what went on in Stockholm, and that is that it became pretty clear that there would be a sort of a transfer of burden from people coming from New Jersey into Manhattan to people coming from Long Island into Manhattan, and that the folks in those suburbs were complaining about equity on a wide spectrum of it being unfair to low-income people, unfair to folks traveling from the suburbs. What's interesting is that the inner ring residents, especially in Manhattan, just north of the proposed toll ring, were much more enthusiastic about the project and much more likely to be people of color and lower income in the north end of Manhattan than were many of the people raising the objections. And that this has come up in a similar way in Stockholm. A big issue was trying to quell the dissent among people from the outer ring suburbs who were in fact going to incur more costs as a result of this toll. They were making much broader equity claims, but it was a shift, and in that sense, it was a shift in burden, and they were reacting to that. But I think, in making those claims of inequity, they were using a big tent in terms of who would be hurt by it.
An interesting point about New York. I just wanted to not let it go by, because I had some meetings in New York, and it seemed as though that issue between the suburbs that were in New York State and the suburbs that are in New Jersey was a really dominant one. And that's not the one that people talk about, low income versus high income and so on. And it was just a quirk of the situation, because currently the New Jersey bridges are tolled, but the other ones are not. And this was going to even that out. And
increased fairness.
Right. I mean, that's a perfect example where many people would say it's correcting an unfairness, but it was a change in a way that could easily be targeted by the people who were going to be hurt as unfair to them relative to New Jerseyans. And of course, since it was a New York State legislature that had to vote on it,
New Jerseyans don't put anyone in the state house and all that.
That argument won out, and it was the legislature that finally, it was just one house of the legislature that actually turned it down. It passed about 6 or 7 other hurdles before it got to that.
I don't want people to get the impression that I don't agree with him, because I do. But I think the fact that, in collective decision-making and in politics more generally, equity is a fundamental and foundational question that arises over just about every public decision-making that we do. So the fact that, and I would argue, and I do argue in another manuscript coming out in Environment and Planning A, is that, in many respects, our public discourse around social equity is so debased that we have people who make social equity claims that are largely just specious. And if you look at the actual title of this session, it's not about equality and it's not about equity. The actual name of the panel is about social inclusion. And this question of, if we create pricing regimes, do we just keep people out of social and economic activities? As in, Do we price them out, if by pricing people off the road during peak hours, do we price them out of jobs, and do we price them out of social opportunities that they then cannot recover from? And that's a lot different from this question of, I have to pay for something that I didn't have to pay for before, and that strikes me as something that I don't like doing. And I didn't really feel like I had control over this decision, so the rest of you people are mean, mean, mean fans. Right? That fundamental question of, how do we deal with people who are deeply impoverished or who are at the working poor margins of mobility, when there's a parallel discussion in the literature about how cars and car ownership and operating vehicles is too expensive for them anyway, right? How do we deal with that group versus, you know, I'm unhappy, this hits my neighborhood harder than other neighborhoods, even though this neighborhood has ubiquitous access to just about every place in the region because, you know, we are affluent to begin with. You know, it may strike you as something that isn't equally applied, but that is, we just don't treat all claims of injustice as equally valid. And we don't do that for good reasons in the academic literature, but in the political discussion, they're often treated as equal, or you know, the haves and the have-mores often get greater deference in their equity claims than the people who have legitimate civil rights questions, right, in the public sphere. And so I'm going to push back on this and say, this isn't really about sort of satisfying the largest whiner in the political joint. The question that should be in front of us is, do we essentially cripple suburbs that have large contingents of impoverished people in them if we go down this road?
Well, let me ask you a question, just a brief follow-up to that is, I just was reading something in the New York Times recently about an experiment where some people have a certain kind of brain injury and it can affect some of their moral judgments. And one of the classic tests they'll do with small children, say a toddler, is they ask them, well, you know, one child tried to break this egg and knocked it over, but it didn't break, and another one inadvertently bumped into some eggs and the whole dozen broke. You know, who was bad? And the toddler would say, well, the kid who knocked the dozen over. Then you ask that child later, and you say, what? You know, so a 10-year-old, what was the effect? They say, oh, the kid who meant to break the egg, not the outcome. So intent has a huge part of it. One of the issues that's come up a lot, and I've been, you know, I've done this as well, just say, well, you know, I've heard people from the trucking industry say, well, they're very concerned about how prices can affect poor people, and you think, well, this is sort of cynical and tactical, and so somewhat dismissive. But what if the claim has merit, even if it's posed cynically? And I think that's, I think that what happens sometimes in people's enthusiasm, for example, to support things like road pricing, which I'm personally very supportive, is that people will dismiss the arguments of people who clear to be making them on somewhat cynical grounds. But their claims may still have merit. And that I think goes to the point you're making about, you know, even if a group is somewhat cynically doing this, they may still have some merit in some of the concerns about how, for example, low-income people might be affected by these pricing claims. And I think that we're not really addressing.
Yeah, what I'm trying to get at is sort of this basic difference of, you know, maybe I started at the university the same year as another assistant professor, and perhaps our salaries are different, right? And that may be sort of objectively unfair, and I might have cause to whine, but I'm not on food stamps. Right, if I were on food stamps, or if I were so deeply impoverished, then I think I would have that my claim to injustice or inequality should take precedence in these sorts of questions about pricing public finance, over and above those that are sort of merely about, you know, are we treating like groups as like, right?
Did you want to say something? Yes, we've experienced that with our LA County Hot Lanes or Express Lanes project. As you've already heard from the panel, definitely at the elected official level, they immediately were concerned about social equity and pricing and whether or not we were going to price folks from the roads. So they put in our legislation that we're required to conduct an assessment on the impact of low-income commuters, provide mitigation. And that was the first time they've done that in the state. No other toll agency has had to do that before. But when we actually went out and talked to the community, especially in our two corridors, the 110 freeway, as many of you know, a high proportion of residents fall in the lower income strata, as well as a portion of the 10 freeway. When we talked to them and told them, oh, you know, we're going to have to offer you toll credits, by and large we were told, we don't want your toll credits, we don't We don't think we're going to use those lanes. What about transit? I want more transit service. So there, there was a different issue about equity, but fortunately, our approach to implementing congestion pricing was to look at the whole system, and the carpool lanes are successful, the transit is successful, and we wanted to enhance that. So our plan already includes adding substantially more bus service, and so that was something that we could share with the community, and that's what they gravitated to, and that's what's opened up the acceptance level, at least for trying out the demo. But it was interesting. It was a huge difference. At the elected official level, it was about price and toll. It's not fair to pay. When we get on the actually grassroots level, I want more transit service. Or the access points for the carpool lanes don't let me get off in my community, so I won't be using those lanes. So it's a very real issue.
Well, that's interesting, because I was going to give a similar answer to your question about suburbs. What about suburbs that have, Mr. Fleece's question, what about suburbs that have impoverished people? And I think, more generally, I would say, what options do those people have for not having to pay the toll is a key, a big factor in determining how badly they're going to be hurt by it. And public transit is for sure the biggest of those. There may be others too. What much job hour flexibility they have, what are carpooling options, and so forth. And I think the places where you've seen congestion pricing implemented on a large-scale basis are places that have really good transit systems, London, Stockholm, Singapore, and that's no accident, because that can make it work. It's harder for Los Angeles, probably, because we have such a spread out area, but I think those efforts that you're talking about are the right way to address it.
I think this is an appropriate time to have a conversation about the relationship in terms of how public transit is actually benefited by congestion pricing, because I'm not sure that's generally perceived to be the case. So I'm going to let it go on in that way, but I am going to circle back to who uses the lanes eventually, because there's a point that hasn't been made yet that I'm going to make sure is made. She's like this all the time. So why don't we talk a little bit about public transit and what happens? And we were having a side conversation at lunch. The London case is a very interesting case in terms of impacts on public transit. So maybe somebody on the panel would like to say a little bit about the London experience to start us off.
Well, I've actually written about it, so I see the eyes turning to me. It has a tremendously beneficial effect on transit, and some of it is ways you wouldn't necessarily think of. I mean, first you've got the direct, let me start off. You decongest the streets. That means bus transit can go more quickly on the streets. It means it can offer better service to people. It's faster. It's more reliable, because one of the things that makes buses always be late is because the congestion tends to be unpredictable. What the user might not think about so much is also saving a lot of driver time. Driver cost is the biggest cost in just about any transit system, especially for buses. The drivers are also going faster, and by improving reliability, their schedules can be tightened up. So you're saving costs.
And with faster vehicle times, without adding more vehicles, you're lowering headways. So you're in a sense,
yes,
you're in a sense sort of adding service without really adding service.
That's right. That's right. So you get all the benefit, and then in addition, there's this effect. It's sort of a scale economies effect, if you will. The more people are riding transit, because you're also drawing people onto transit from the roads as a response to the pricing. The more people are riding transit, the more economical it is to improve the service by more frequency or more routes. And so that makes the service better for people. So I actually have often said, I mean, most people think, well, you've got to offer transit in order to make congestion pricing work, and that I agree with. But you might look at it the other way around too. If you've got big problems with transit system and you're in deficits and everything else, pricing would be a way to help you dig your way out of those.
I think also the net toll revenues can be reinvested in transit. San Diego's doing it. We will be doing it. It's a nice way to reinvest in and ensure that if you do add additional transit service, you've got operating fund source to ensure that they can keep operating.
So there's also kind of another angle to this, which has to do with kind of the equity across modes, right? And so could we argue that congestion pricing kind of levels the playing field for transit?
Yeah, I think well, I think that I do want to be careful here that we don't fall into the trap of assuming that sort of public transit and auto use are entirely sort of interchangeable, and that poor people use transit and wealthy people drive. And I know we know it's a mix that in general that most transit users are indeed poor. That's the case in LA and it's the case nationwide. But most poor people travel in cars. More people in low-income households, considerably more, drive to work than they do take transit. And even in zero-vehicle households, you're about 40% more likely to be getting to work in a car than on public transit. So public transit plays this important role, but it certainly doesn't accomplish all those trips. So even if we do a terrific job with providing those transit options, whether because of traveling in an unsafe neighborhood or to a location that just doesn't work for public transit, or needing to carry a lot of goods, that there are going to be times where people are going to travel by transit. Something that I'd look forward to having a conversation with Ken about is this idea that, in general, we think of people's value of time varying in some way with their income. But I know that the Brits are really doing a lot about kind of time-poor households. That a lot of low-income households will have, the single mom will be incredibly stressed in terms of work and household responsibilities. They may not have much ability to trade off time-saving things for using money to trade that off, but they still might have what might be realized sort of an unrealized high value of time, so that even if there is a significant burden to paying a toll, we may, it may be that in a sense value of that may vary a lot. There may be a significant income burden, but there may be some time benefits that are significant as well.
Well, the empirical evidence is there is a lot of variation in value of time across otherwise identical people, that is, people who look identical if you measure their income or their family size or their race or gender. So that fits with that. There's anecdotal experience with the hot lanes in the United States that show that one of the groups that use them a lot are working class, self-employed people, plumbers, electricians, people like that. And presumably that's because they're actually in a money-earning mode at the times that they need to travel, and so they'll pay a lot to speed up their trip, because if the time they're spending on the road is time they're not billing a client. But can I return to the other thing you said, you were, I guess, Jen, you said about equity between transit and highways, kind of.
Drivers.
I have a lot of trouble with the concept of equity across modes, because modes are just abstract things, and the people who use them can shift back and forth according to conditions, and they do. And in particular, this one, if I were to try to make a case that transit as a mode somehow is treated inequitably relative to highways, I couldn't make it. We subsidize transit much, much more than we do highways in proportional terms. So actually, I think a lot of people who kind of live in exurbia and are highway dependent would look at it exactly the opposite and say, well, those big cities are sucking up all the money for public transit that people aren't paying for, because the fares only cover 30 or 40% of the cost, and that's just operating cost usually. So I don't think I would want to make the argument that this is somehow redressing an inequity across modes.
Although politically, you have interests that are modally based, and they have enormous power, and they tend to frame debates over allocation of resources entirely in terms of modal interests. Yeah. How does the trucking industry feel about that?
In fact,
what do the transit folks say?
The San Diego hot lane is there because there was a transit advocate, a state assemblyman, I think, or a state senator from suburban San Diego who wanted transit through that district, and here was a way to pay for it.
I mean,
that's how it's
I used to have, well, actually, Andy Sable, one of Brian's colleagues at UCLA, he's a political philosopher, and he'd write these essays on justice for him. And if we digressed into something that didn't really matter, he would write WC as shorthand for who cares on that universe. And when it comes down to some of those questions about, oh, it's not fair, my favorite mode isn't getting the sort of public allocations that I think it should. Oh, you've got all these years, you've got the cards stacked against transit and all these other things. I think that's a perfectly reasonable discussion to have, but I don't think it necessarily frames, it necessarily fits within a question about social equity in the way that pricing does here, in that the real equity issues with regard to funding transit or boosting transit funding have to do with the fact that failures in service quality across the board, whether it's in congested freeways or on congested buses, on buses that are arriving haphazardly, they're skipping stops, they're overcrowded and all those other things, that those service quality issues are borne disproportionately by a subset of the population that is deeply impoverished, and that this in and of itself, the service quality, right, in and of itself is a major barrier to social access and a major barrier to social inclusion amongst the individuals that we would actually be concerned about having legitimate claims of civil rights violations and legitimate claims of historic, long-standing social injustices and social inequality. And in order for modes to justify their existence, they have to have value. In terms of efficiency arguments, but in terms of equity arguments, these derive essentially from the constituencies and the people that they serve. And I think we can place a deeper moral imperative based on the fact that this is a lifeline service, right? This is not additional mobility. This is a baseline level of social inclusion and social access that you can provide, right? It's the key to regional economic and social citizenship.
So let's go down this path for a minute. It's certainly, as was pointed out earlier, at least in cases where we've seen congestion pricing, there is a benefit in terms of quality of service, right? And in terms of being able to actually increase service because demand increases. And so in that scenario, our most disadvantaged population is going to get some serious benefits. They're still transit dependent, but now they have a better service than they had before. So that that would be a definite kind of social equity benefit that you might not always think about in terms of congestion pricing as a policy. That's good. Now let's talk a little bit about the revenue side. You heard Stephanie say we're going to use some of this money to actually subsidize transit, right? Or to add to the subsidies that are going to transit. I think somebody already pointed out that at least in LA Metro's case, we are at 20-some-odd% fare recovery, 24%, which means that 3/4 of all operating costs are being paid for something other than fares, and 100% of all the capital. Okay, so huge contributions on the public side. And those revenues come from a lot of different interesting places. In the case of Los Angeles County, we have now 1.5 cents worth of sales taxes. A huge amount of that goes into the transit system. So what I want us, maybe we should talk a little bit about, there's kind of this secondary effect in terms of equity when we start turning the sources of subsidies around. So I wondered if anybody wanted to talk.
Could you elaborate on what you mean by that last clause in that last sentence?
Well, if the distributional implications of money that's coming out of tolls that's being paid that goes into subsidies is a very different source of revenue than sales taxes, because of the difference in the incidence. So would you like to talk a little bit about that? Sort of, to me, it's almost like a secondary impact that you want to think about in congestion pricing. Because it changes where the revenues are going to come from, or it could.
Well, to make the argument that way, I think you have to imagine a slightly different scenario than, say, Stephanie was saying, where take congestion pricing and revenues and put them in public transit. You have to imagine, take them and substitute for some other source of money that now is being used for transit or something else. So that's another possibility. I think that's more likely in the U.S. in some cases to happen than it is, say, in Europe, where mostly they have gone into transit. So then you want to compare, which I think Jen, you're starting to do, what's the distribution of congestion fees versus sales tax, or fuel tax, or some other source of funds. And that's something people have written. I mean, we have information about that. I don't know quite how to summarize it. Sales taxes are pretty regressive, although they have lots of exemptions that helps reduce that. So I'm not sure how the balance comes out with that.
People have asked
They're
me.
still regressive.
Yeah. People have asked me about this, and that I'm not a huge fan of the sales tax across the board for a variety of reasons, but Measure R in Southern California didn't really bother me, and you've reasonable people calling me on this, and that was essentially because I think sales taxes that go into public transit, given that there's yes, it's a regressive finance tool, but then the actual disbursement of it goes to services that are primarily for people who are impoverished, and sort of at the lower income levels, but that in some can turn out to be a progressive regime because, regressivity isn't the whole story here.
But the biggest losers are low-income sales taxpayers who can't make use of public transit.
Who can't make use of public
Right,
transit,
so there's
that's
a big
right.
transfer from those people to people who are able to make use of
That's
it.
right, but
It's such a broad tax base that their out-of-pocket costs can be, I think, legitimized. I mean, like I said, I don't love this tool, but I also don't hate it when we're talking about using it for public transit. I do really hate it when we talk about using sales taxes to fund highways. Right there, I think the sort of equity and public finance problems become very clear. And yes, for people who are unable to use for whom transit just doesn't work, they are out of pocket.
Both, right?
Yes,
it does.
Just like in Orange County, ours does.
Yeah.
Ours is predominantly
But you could also make arguments. I mean, this is, for me, the whole question about financing transportation services is often very interesting because we have this discussion about sort of how we subsidize transit use. And that's fine, but there's a whole bunch of other municipal services that aren't really asked to pay their own way either.
That's right.
And I never understood why transit kind of gets beat up on this regard. We don't, people who are out, nobody sort of wags their fingers at, the people removing snow on Minnesota streets, well, that's, homeowners are not paying per square foot for that snow removal. No, they're not. They're paying into a collective urban fund, and those are sort of urban services that are shared and broadly available. And so if the argument is essentially that public transit is something that is sort of quintessentially necessary to the fabric of an urban environment and that has this additional effect of being a lifeline service for people who don't have access to cars, I think there are rationales for essentially saying, yeah, users are only paying 20% of its cost, but that the rest of us have a reasonable enough rationale to chuck in some money. I'm not as disturbed by something like that as I am about freeways that have, a fairly sizable external cost portfolio, and that in many respects serve to distribute housing opportunities that many people are locked out of.
So if we go back to Brian's identified constituency, low-income households who don't really have a transit option. What do we do about them, if anything?
Are you answering? Or am I?
No, I asked the question.
Well, I thought you had an answer. I thought you had all the answers.
Well,
There's
a, if we're talking about congestion pricing, we're going to generate a whole lot of revenue, right? There's lots of things we can do with it.
Well, okay, let's take that. I mean, it's interesting. The improvements are the transit improvements you're talking about are in the corridor.
Yeah, that's what
So okay, so I mean, you can keep backing up. So you can say, well, we could do that, or we could say, well, what MTA lines serve the lowest income population, and let's put the money there. Or you could say, well, okay, well, what MTA riders are lowest income, and let's provide essentially fare credits where people can buy, $20 worth of fares for $10 or something that allow the very poorest people to do that. Or you can take a step back further and say, well, then why don't we just redistribute the income through a negative income tax to give it to the very lowest income people and let them make choices about how they want to use that. You can keep working your way back, but clearly a geographic equity logic is in fact defining a lot of that, because you're saying, well, it's got to be in that corridor, right?
Absolutely.
So it's really about, well, somehow the people who are driving in the HOT lanes their equity requires that in that corridor there be transit service that gets extra subsidy. What if the riders on those lines are higher income than the riders on average elsewhere? Then it could be satisfying some equity concern. That is that somehow there's being tolls levied in that corridor, even though the toll payers are doing so voluntarily, but we're going to provide subsidized service in that corridor because somehow that's the unit of analysis that's affected. But when you start doing that, you create all of we create all of these things where we're going to try and make these adjustments, all because we're not willing to do other things like make sure that people have lifeline income or something and allow them to make these other choices. So you keep backing up and you'll always get more efficiency as you move back at the same way you might be able to increase equity. But that's an interesting one because in many ways we're defining the social equity and concern really in terms of geographic bounds.
Well, and I would agree with Brian. I think for our project, our premise was we needed to look at it for congestion reduction, not financing. If we were looking at financing, then you open the box of where the toll revenues could go. But for us, we have to have the funding, the net revenues reinvested in the corridor to ensure that the benefit that we're providing is sustainable. If we reinvest those toll revenues in another corridor and there are breakdowns, maintenance issues with the express lanes, or we lose the transit service because of budget cuts, then we've just defeated the benefits of the express lanes. So our legislation requires it to be reinvested in the corridor that it's generated. It also helps with the community acceptance too. If I use that corridor, I know that the toll that I am choosing to pay, if I choose to pay it, will be reinvested in improvements in that corridor.
Well, but that's completely logical, but of course the people who promulgated the legislation had in mind that that was a reasonable bound for equity, right? That somehow that's the sort of the affected corridor, and that's where sort of equity claims are adjudicated, is within that corridor, within not corridor, across the.
And it's really, you can monitor the level of congestion by the price.
That's right.
Right?
That's right.
And so whether or not you have transit is kind of almost a different issue. Well, you could take care of the congestion if you wanted to, without any impact on transit, if you wanted to.
If we wanted to, but our wonderful legislature limited us in our ability to use congestion pricing to its full market benefits. Congestion pricing, I think in its purest form, has no limit on what the price can be.
That's right.
But again, our elected officials have said that we have to have a cap.
Oh,
so that limits the ability to really use pricing to its fullest. The other, though, unique thing about our corridors, the 10 and the 110, is the carpool lanes today with the bus service, they carry half of the freeway users during the peak period, so they are beneficial. And so we want to ensure that that can continue. So our increase in transit and focus on transit and carpooling is not incidental. It's not an equity issue. It's that they work now, but we want to ensure that they continue to work.
I want to go back before I'm going to open it up to the audience in just a minute. There was just, Brian and Ken hit on this in one of their comments that I think, Brian, you started it with talking about highly time-constrained people, okay? And that sort of goes back to my much earlier question on who's actually willing to pay and who actually uses the lanes. And actually, I was going to ask Lisa to talk a little bit about some of our discussions that we've had in terms of gender differences in value of time and willingness to pay, to sort of think about yet another dimension of the way that tolls play across different population groups.
Okay, well, one of the reasons why we started working on this paper at one point, Jen and I did, and one of the things that has always been very interesting to me is that whenever anybody wants to write a Jeremy ad in the newspaper against hot lanes or against congestion pricing, the single mom always comes up. It's like, oh, you know, the poor single mother will be sitting there sweltering without a radio, and, you know, her car will be, you know, baking in the sun while the, you know, sort of privileged, you know, and it's always a man, right, you know, partner of her law firm, you know, she sweeps the floors or answers the phone or something menial because that's what women do. He will be, you know, hopping into the hot lane in his Lexus right, so that he can enjoy an extra round of golf and an extra martini, right? And that this kind of narrative is extremely frustrating to me because it's very hard to counteract these types of wonderful stories. But you think about the single mom, and the reason why she comes up in these equity discussions a lot is that a single parent, right, but we want to talk about the gender aspects, but a single parent in many respects epitomizes somebody who is both time poor and money poor, right? You think about congestion pricing, it's one of those things where you leverage people's value of time and their out-of-pocket costs. And so if somebody is sort of wedged between those or held in a tension between time and money, they are probably somebody for whom transit is not a really good substitute, because the on-time performance of transit or its inflexibility may make their lives very difficult, so they're very dependent on their cars. But they also, right, if a single mom in particular is trying to run a household without the benefit often of male wages, which tend to be systematically higher than female wages. And so this is a classic example of somebody who is both time poor and money poor, and this is exactly the sort of person who can get whipsawed between in pricing policies where, and she's one of those exemplars of people that I think may actually be worse off in some types of congestion regimes, but are almost always made better off by hot lane regimes. In that we can't assume that her time on any given day is worth nothing and she'd rather sit there, right? One of the problems with the status quo bias is that we cannot assume that congestion delays are somehow distributed in an equitable way now, right? If she's sitting there on the freeway, she's probably sweating bullets about how much she's paying her babysitter while she sits there. She may be worrying about hours that she didn't get to work. There's all sorts of reasons why we need to be worried about that person's congestion delays as much as we should probably be worried about how much she pays in terms of a congestion toll. And we almost never have that part of the discussion about how congestion and delays and externalities are distributed when we should have it. So, but at the same time, the hot lane may potentially be a much more progressive outcome for somebody like this, because there may be days when it's absolutely worth it to her to save the money, and there may be other days when it's absolutely worth it to her to spend the money. And by creating a diversity of services in a particular corridor, that diversity of services itself allows her to optimize on the exigencies of any given day, right? Which we, as public providers of infrastructure or public policy or finance, don't have as much information about as she does. Right? and that sort of creating that level of service diversity in of itself is a bump in service quality that really adds value to the, sort of questions about gender and mobility that often don't get raised in very intelligent ways. So while we're sitting here wringing our hands about, our sense of class envy may be very well served by thinking about that law partner who doesn't get to have his martini or his 9 rounds of golf. But in reality, even if he puts his Lexus in the Lexus lane and gets the heck out of her way, she's better off, right? Anything we can do to get rid of them is just better off. And then by secondarily giving her the same option as him, right? He probably has a nanny, he probably has a gardener, he's probably got somebody to clean his house and she does not, right? That time-money trade-off can be very sharp for people who don't have the same level of resources. So that's kind of one of our lines of thinking.
Right, and I just want to kind of bring out the parallel to what Ken's comment about the entrepreneur as being a more frequent user, because under certain circumstances to actually get to that job is a really big deal. Mm-hmm. And the other thing I just kind of wanted to emphasize is this concept that all congestion pricing is certainly not created equal. We talked about London, which has a cordon, so everybody pays during certain hours, right? With amazing exceptions there too that I won't go into. And in the case of what's being planned in Los Angeles, we're talking about adding a choice model, which has turned out, at least in the United States, to be a much easier political sell. So we see much more of that than. And I'm not sure we see, outside of the Dulles Toll Road or places like that where there is no direct choice. Unless my great panel members would like to make another comment, I am going to open it up to questions.
I do want to make another comment.
Okay.
And that is that I think that many people who are really sincerely concerned about equity, you raise this London comparison. Hotlines are really puzzling, right? Because people have a choice whether to use them at every given point, and that if a low-income person is using it, by definition, we assume they're better off for having had that choice, and if they choose not to, or if a wealthy person chooses not to, that they're better off. And so that one sort of, and I think it points out to kind of how vexing this question is that when you create a situation where people have a choice that they didn't before, there's concern that some people may make that choice, and that's somehow unfair. And I think that's an interesting thing to sort of puzzle out. What I wanted to add to that is that, it seems as though one of the things, because we weren't able to toll and we were looking for ways to try and increase the efficiency of roadways, came up with the idea of HOV lanes. So what we'll do is we'll give a priority to people who form into carpools. That way we can increase the person throughput over the vehicle throughput, and there'd be some efficiency as a result. But it's very difficult to regulate that. You have to have integers of people in the car. You can't give a 1.5 or 2.5, and it's very clumsy. And so you have a hot lane on top of it. But because we've started with this idea of that, well, there's some sense in trying to give priority to multiple occupant vehicles, it's now become sort of inculcated into law that there is a moral right to not pay a toll as a result of being in an HOV, and that many of these systems are complicated immensely by the fact that we have to somehow give free or reduced passage to an HOV, when, if you're in an HOV, of course, the toll is split 2 or 3 ways. And there's a lot of concern, well, a lot of these HOVs are really family members. Well, if they are, then they're not split 2 or 3 ways, and that has an effect on that. So they'd be simplified in many ways, and in fact, we should expect to see a big increase in carpooling, because of one way to reduce the toll is to pair up, which should increase efficiency as well. So we have this idea that somehow, well, we had the second best alternative, which was to create these HOV lanes as a way of trying to do a non-pricing way of pricing. Once that's there, that's now an interest that has sort of a moral right a sort of first refusal on that capacity, and that we'll only price up to what those other people are using, never mind that it might make sense just to have everyone pay and actually encourage more carpooling as a result. So, and I bet that Stephanie there's a lot of complication with trying to cope with the moral right of people in a carpool to maintain their free passage.
Well, then you have to add the moral right of people in a Prius.
Oh yeah, well that's another issue. But I just wanted to toss that out there, that we sort of take that as given. It's just, well, yeah, they should have.
I really think Brian's hit on something. It could be another workshop in and of itself. It's a huge issue. And if any of you have driven the 4 or 5 carpool lane, it's two or more people is required. It's basically a crawl. And the idea of HOVs would you'd be able to increase the minimum occupancy requirement. Well, that is now forbidden. I mean, it's ridiculous. And one of the major challenges, again, with our project, we wanted to have the flexibility to increase the occupancy requirement. We're limited in state law. We cannot do that for a demo, which is unfortunate. And you even have a lawmaker trying to introduce legislation to do just that, that says as of January 2011, if you were an existing HOV, you never can be tolled on any hotline, which defeats the whole purpose of congestion pricing. But
this is like Prop 13 for...
Prop 13 for congestion pricing. This entitlement is really bad. The Prius people are out of control. They really are. There's such a sense of entitlement. Thankfully, they're going away. But, one of the equity issues
they're never going away.
Well, the legislation for the yellow stickers, I'm happy to say.
The stickers will fade.
And the stickers bake off after a while.
But the existing carpoolers are really upset about, some of them are really upset about our congestion pricing demo. They feel like it's going to take away their space, et cetera. And
on the subject of yellow stickers, I have heard informally that there's a market in yellow stickers.
Yes.
So talk about willingness to pay, right?
Absolutely.
All right.
Craigslist, I think there was at least $2 to $3 grand markup.
Whoa!
Yeah.
So Stephanie, no, Priuses are wonderful. It's Prius owners who are insufferable.
Well, that is true.
Yeah.
That is true.
Yeah.
That's true.
Let me just mention, since we're on moral arguments here, on State Route 91, one of the hot lanes, the one in Orange County, the Riverside Freeway, the moral argument in favor of carpools trumped the one in favor of Priuses, because the carpools get the discount, but the Priuses don't.
Oh,
that's what we'll be doing. Yeah.
All right.
Priuses won't. If they want a carpool, they'll get the toll free, but I don't know.
Okay. You all have sat here patiently for roughly an hour, so I think it's more than time for the audience to be able to chime in here.
I have a question to start off. Assuming we actually get to a VMT-based system with smart vehicles, so ostensibly we could price every trip uniquely from where it started to where it stopped and when it was taken. What does that do to all this? When we get to the point that you could actually charge people for what they do on an individual basis, so it kind of takes it off whether they're, you know, where they're traveling. But as I say, I think, as I understand the end game of that particular technology, that every trip could in fact be priced. Some might be priced at zero, but you know, that ostensibly driving into LA at 8 a.m. would have a high value and therefore a high price. What does that do overall to this kind of what you've been talking about for an hour?
Can I offer sort of an opening sort of political economy response to that about why virtually everyone except academics are wary of that sort of a system? Is that that whatever system we have now is a result of decades of bitter battles over how to establish the rules of the game in terms of what's charged, who pays, and how the revenues are divided up. The fact that you say, well, we could have a tabula rasa, we could start all over, we could charge on emissions and delay and axle weights and all sorts of things that result in lots of benefits. Well, we could also not charge on those things. We could charge a flat fee for everyone, and we could charge inversely. We could say, well, goods movement is an important part of the economy, and we're going to let trucks go for free. And in other words, it sort of opens up, all of those negotiations are opened up again, and everything is fair game. And I think that people's naturally, by people I mean sort of interests groups, naturally risk-averse approach to this is they know what they have now, even if they're not happy with it. But opening everything up, things could conceivably be a lot worse. And because of that, and because of, I think, this sort of, you know, status quo bias in the way that these things are worked out, is that people are very reluctant, and that even, you know, many environmentalists are very concerned about moving to VMT fees because they worry about it being a flat fee for everyone, regardless of emission, regardless of axle weight, regardless of fuel efficiency. And so they think, well, that could be a lot worse than a fuel tax now, which at least charges per gallon. So because of that, I think almost the enormous benefit is seen as a liability. And the example I would give is that transit systems all over the country are adopting smart cards. Smart cards allow us to charge a person when they get on the vehicle for how long they're on and when they get off. And I can tell you that marginal costs of transit service vary enormously. No one is pursuing that. All it is yet another, along with the punch card, the tokens, the monthly pass, it's just another tool that's being used to pay for it. So you have this tremendous potential, but you have all of these interests that have negotiated all these other fare instruments, and they have no interest in giving those up because, well, am I going to win or lose under this system where I would now pay more in the peak and less in the off-peak, or for a longer trip or shorter trip? So you have this ability now. That's hypothetical. I mean, we could work it out with VMT fees. We have it now for transit. It could be put into place. In fact, most of these systems are now wired for it. Nobody is charging when you get off the vehicle because we have the ability to deduct the fare when you get off and sort of charge what you use. There's the lack of progress on that, I think, is evidence of how reluctant people are to move from a sort of a negotiated regime, whatever that might be.
Yeah, I think that's a really good answer, and good that you gave yours first, because I was going to say, theoretically, yes, you can get more benefits that way. You can fine-tune the congestion, and economists know how to spin the models to do that, and traffic engineers using network programs. And people have done a number of studies to see how much more would the benefits be from doing a real fine-tuning pricing than, say, just a simple cordon. And it's quite a bit more, maybe twice as much, and it depends on the situation. But I think Brian is right. I think it would be very difficult to just sort of put in a new system from tabula rasa and build it up that way. What's more likely is that we might see incremental changes, like say someone will have a system in place and someone will say, why don't we charge based on fuel economy? Maybe this would be a contender in place of a cap and trade policy or something else. And so you might get an adjustment for that, or some adjustment for heavy vehicles if there's a problem with roads wearing out and so forth.
Stephanie, since we know that transit service does a really good job of getting people in and out of the downtown at peak hours, I'm wondering with reinvestment into the corridor, if you looked at where the people in the corridor work and at what times they work, and if it would be possible to actually invest in expanded service to maybe off peak hours or to that time, or how exactly how the funds are limited in terms of reinvestment into the corridor.
Yeah, we will look at all of those factors. What we've done deliberately is not state where the net toll revenues are going to be reinvested. One, demonstration hasn't taken place. We don't know how much really we're going to realize. But we will be looking at all of those indicators to determine where the best bang for the buck is. We're fortunate because it is a federal grant. There are a number of performance measurements that will have to take place, and we're actually going to be measuring the baseline performance before we implement, and obviously during the demonstration period. We will be looking at the arterial traffic as well as on the freeway, and we're looking at the bus service as well. So the nice thing about this demo, it's really a pilot project for us to learn from. We have to report to the feds and even back to the state legislature on the performance. But once that demo period completes, which is just a 1-year period, then we'll have the data to really determine where the reinvestment should take place.
Hands there, there. We'll go in that direction. And, oh, I forgot you. Okay, there.
Hi. I would like to know if you think the equity arguments are different if you took an existing traffic lane as opposed to converting an HOV lane to a hot lane. And I ask that question because we're still without any HOV lane to the west side from downtown Los Angeles, perhaps because of an unfortunate experiment 3 decades ago. Exactly. But I think it's amazing in 2010 that there is no HOV connection to the west side. So can any of you contemplate actually seeing politically the taking of a lane to make that a hot lane to the west side, or on the 405 where the existing HOV is already terribly congested in peak periods?
Let me say for the record, our board has not taken a position on that.
I do think the equity issues are different, and it's not just it's not just a question of providing an additional choice. At that point, when you talk about hot lanes being implemented in taking an existing lane away, because essentially by definition that means that the free lanes have reduced capacity, is that we're really dealing with sort of a scaling back of capacity on the corridor of quote-unquote free capacity. And in some respects that can either go up or down depending on how the hot lane is priced and all of those other things. The equity issues are also a little bit different depending on how we decide to run that hot lane. Right? And we haven't really even gotten into this question about concessionaires and franchising and using hot lanes or tolling as a way to support public-private partnerships, right? We haven't even broached that discussion yet. But those are the sorts of, for me, when I think about the equity outcomes, they're contingent on context, and they're contingent on those first sets of decisions about, what kind of tools do you use, what kind of toll regime is it, what is the geographic context, what do you do with the money? Right, and what do you do with supplemental or complementary services and substitute services on the corridor? And all of those can align in a way in which, taking an existing lane for hot lanes can actually be quite pro-social, or those things can happen in such a way that you actually, I think, end up creating sort of a regressive implementation of a hot lane regime, simply because, if you give that hot lane to a concessionaire and then you start signing agreements that say we won't provide any parallel competitors to you, the question becomes sort of, okay, even if we make traffic move more slowly on the free lanes, have we violated our concession or agreement? Is there suddenly a built-in institutional incentive to just let those free lanes go to heck in a handbasket, and all of those other things? And suddenly this doesn't become the choice that it was, or the diversity of choices, or even the premium choice that I framed it as earlier. So I think that's a reasonable question, and the answer is yes, the equity issues are different. The equity answers are different.
Anybody want to add anything, or shall I move on to the next question? I think it was Dan.
I wanted to bring up what I consider at least an equity question that I don't hear being talked about too much. and that is the ability of a fully implemented system to start tweaking the equity issues almost ad infinitum. I mean, you talk about currently segments that have entitlement issues or benefit issues, like Brian, you described quite well why the vehicle is sometimes known as the Toyota Pius. But in some hot lanes in the United States, disabled people get a free pass. Well, that's nice for disabled people. It has nothing to do with transportation issues in the corridor. And the temptation, I'm afraid, will be to continuously argue, lobby for, give breaks. Like Jen described some really egregious exceptions to the London example that have really nothing to do with the original goal of a cordon. So how do you deal with the fact that really all you have to do is reprogram the computer and the equity shifts drastically across the way the programs are implemented? How can you keep public faith in the way the system is designed and operated if you can continuously operate it basically as simply a balance of power between competing interests to give equity shifts in the way it's administered?
Well, I think for the LA project, our board has been really clear and fortunate they've been united on the purpose, which is congestion reduction. If it's clear that your purpose is congestion reduction, then it's easier to address these proposals because regardless of your situation, if you're driving alone and you want a free pass on our hot lanes, that's not going to help us reduce congestion. That's clear in that example. It is more difficult if the primary source is just to raise revenue, because then you do get all of these exceptions. But fortunately, last legislative cycle, there were a number of bills introduced to give doctors free access to HOV lanes and hot lanes. Vets are people who are serving out in Iraq and Afghanistan, and et cetera, and we just had to remain steadfast that we were exempt and we're focused on congestion. But you've got to be clear, I think, to the public, all of your stakeholders on the purpose and try to follow that line.
And this is a really great example when we were, pricing hasn't been around all of that long, but if you actually look at just the various and sundry loopholes or exemption that are given as part of the national tax code, for example, it's about $1.5 trillion a year that we forego, right? And that, if you treat that like a spending program, all of a sudden our deficits vanish, right? All of the worries and problems that we have, and all of those things are things that accumulated over time because this was a big ticket item. And because we don't actually have that many implementation, we don't actually have that much pricing implemented in the United States, we haven't gotten to that level of complexity yet. But I agree with you, if this were to become ubiquitous and the money started getting to be significant, right, I think we would start to see much more complicated questions about exemptions. My husband's an accountant, and he's a tax accountant, and so every single year, I have to, he doesn't rant very often, but every once in a while he'll be shaking his little fist at the sky about, oh, there's a new credit this year for people who ate a bacon-flavored donut on Friday the 13th, right? And it's something that has in no way any sort of public policy justification whatsoever, and just managed to sort of get in there because of the political economy.
And that's, well, I mean, that's the earlier point, especially on the VMT fee, right?
Right.
That's a very flexible, it would be a universal kind of fee, therefore it's going to be subject to all those kinds of things. I'm going to move on because we're getting close to the time and we have at least, I think I saw 3 questions, and I think you are next, the woman in the black suit.
Charisma.
Charisma from UCLA.
Ohio State.
I think this, Charisma AC. I think this question is probably more philosophical maybe for the panel. I wanted to go back to the topic of congestion pricing and social inclusion, the title of the panel. For me, the content resonated a lot with the last panel in terms of I was thinking of social inclusion as where people live, where people work, and maybe even where people play. And when we were talking about housing affordability in the last panel, we saw the difficulties in where people are able to live, whereas a lot of the advocacy work is around subsidizing demand, but people if new affordable houses can't be built and housing is more expensive. Same thing with transit affordability. If, as Brian mentioned, most poor people use cars to get where they need to go. In terms of thinking about equity, is it about subsidizing, reducing their congestion toll, or where's the intersection between transit policy and housing policy, and is it, you know, either from the academic standpoint or a practical standpoint? I'm a little pessimistic from the last panel in terms of what inroads we can really make, given how political these issues are, in terms of whether we allow more people to live or denser housing and letting people live closer to where they work. But sorry if my thoughts are jumbled. They're kind of all over the place with this panel, but if you might talk about the intersection between transit and housing. Thank you.
Take it away.
You want to go for it, Ryan? Well, one is that we do know that transit is valuable and that it attaches a premium to housing costs, right? And so as a result, I think on the housing side, and you remember the question that I asked the panel, which is, you know, we sort of expect the market to supply affordability, which there's really no reason for it to actually do that. In that we have, I think, a public responsibility to think about both job diversity and housing diversity near transit, right? In such a way that we do create opportunities for regional, social, and economic citizenship by virtue of publicly provided goods, and that for the people who can afford it and, you know, who don't want to live any other way, they can then live in whatever house they want. However, right, the market can allocate those kinds of opportunities and those kinds of mobility opportunities, but when we think about public provision for social inclusion, that we have a baseline level of capacity of housing supply and transit service and supply at that low end. That's a challenge, right? I mean, that's one of those things that's very easily said and not very easily implemented, right? The other thing that I want to point out, and that we needed to sort of define this panel, given what's happening in transit companies across the United States, I don't think we can assume that transit fares are affordable everywhere anymore. You know, New Jersey just had a 20% increase in fares. They're already about $2. You talk about people who are at poverty line at $18,000 a year and 2 transit trips a day, or trying to get a pass. Passes aren't all that heavily discounted when you start raising them up like that. Is that transit costs and fares, I mean, we're in our, second fare increase in San Francisco in 4 months, right? And, you know, if you have a car, you can put your kid in the car for no extra money, but if you've got a kid and you've got to take them on transit and it's not a baby that you hold, you've got to pay the additional fare. And so I don't want us to leave here sort of forgetting about that question about transit affordability. And one of the things that I think LA does do very well is that for the most part, we're pretty affordable for a major metropolitan area, right, in terms of keeping transit fares low. But with a $30 million deficit here and an $800 million deficit elsewhere, operating deficit, I don't know that that's going to be something that we can maintain.
250 million.
Chicago's is 300 million. That's why that one came to mind. But there, I mean, you want to name me a big city, and I can talk to you about their $100 million operating deficits this year. And so what are they doing? They're doing all sorts of things that deeply affect impoverished travelers, right? They're cutting services, right, where transit is already not particularly competitive, and they're raising fares. This is a recipe for cutting people out of the social fabric of the city.
I think we should, there was one over here. Who was over here? You're the, yeah, I have you, thank you. There, but I thought that, go ahead.
You've all pointed out that a lot of the resistance to congestion pricing is because people perceive that they have something for free now, and now they're going to have to begin to pay for it, so it's perceived as a loss. And we all know that people really show a lot of loss aversion. And I'm wondering if there's ways to reframe going from the current system to a market-based system that frames it as a possible gain instead of as a loss. So one example is Don Stroop's idea about parking, where you can cash out your parking space. That's framed as a gain because you get money if you're willing to forego your parking space. Similarly, in traffic congestion, you have people to pay to get onto less congested lanes, but they become less congested because someone is forsaking being on that lane at that particular time. Is there a policy, a way to design policies such that we can actually benefit those people who make the decisions to decongest roadways and therefore benefit everyone else?
Let me just very briefly say that in terms of marketing, lots of places around the country call it value pricing. because they have figured out what you said, that congestion pricing and it sounds like a penalty, but if it's value pricing, it means you're actually making a choice and you're getting value for your choice. I'll just let other people answer the rest of the question.
I almost think you have to somehow redefine the status quo in order to have people think of it that way. So that's part of the arguments that we and others have made or alluded to about why do people think the current system is so fair, that any deviation of it, they raise fairness issues. If you can somehow get the public discourse oriented around a different base case, then maybe you can make the congestion pricing one look good. But I'm not a marketer, so I don't really know how to do that.
The thing I would add is that I think part of the problem here is that all of this discussion has been sort of in the realm of public policy and finance, and that there's a traffic engineering element to this, and it has a lot to do with nonlinear relationships in traffic, and that small changes at the margin when volume is close to capacity can have a huge effect either way. Either when you're right near capacity, a few extra vehicles can significantly increase delay, and a few fewer can have big benefits. And so we just aren't programmed to think in nonlinear terms. And so I think that very intelligent lay people can say, well, you'd have to get rid of 2/3 of all these cars around me before things would be free flowing, when in fact that isn't the case. Or it's unlikely. I don't think that people will assume completely inelastic responses to price changes, and in fact, it doesn't require an enormously elastic response in many cases to get significant benefit. You heard Stephanie make comment, and I think Ken did as well, is that some of these lanes can be carrying, you'll have two of the SR91 lanes that are carrying nearly, not quite, but nearly half the people moving through the corridor in the peak hour, and the 4 lanes will be carrying, a little over half. Well, that shows you the enormous efficiency benefits it can gain, and that's what's gotten a lot of transportation geeks excited about this for a very long time. That often is sort of the potential enormous efficiency gains are often lost, and because that's abstract and it's nonlinear, it's harder to kind of make the case, well, gee, if you pay this, you can get a lot back, because a sensible person says, I just don't see it there. You're just going to have to kick a lot of people off the road, and you have to kick some people off at the right time, but you may ultimately have more people on if you play your cards right. And so it's a very unstable and highly nonlinear situation, and that just doesn't square with intuition, which makes it harder to frame it as something you're selling in a very concrete way, because people are skeptical that it's really going to have that effect.
But let me add one thing to my earlier answer. Maybe, and I just thought of this for the first time, maybe reframing the status quo is one of the functions of projections that people make. Every few years, SCAG comes up with some projection, and they say in near 20 and 15 years from now, traffic's going to be crawling on the freeways at 7 miles per hour. And people kind of laugh at it, and they say this is stupid because we'll never let that happen. But maybe they're trying to get people to start from a different status quo as they examine alternative policies, so that what might have looked like a loss will actually, when they get in their mind that they might be traveling at 7 miles per hour, it'll look like a gain.
There's kind of one last point that is, it amazes me sometimes, but even really smart people do not believe that peak pricing actually would work. They fundamentally don't believe it. And so the idea that you could save time, which is a great attraction to lots of people, they sort of discount because they don't believe it'll actually happen. And so one of the really good things about demonstrations is that you start to get some evidence that it really happens. And that was one of the things I think that's really important about London, because London has shown how many things positive could actually come out of it. Last question.
One question is, I'm not sure what this project is designed to demonstrate that hasn't already been demonstrated on the 91 toll roads and others. I don't know if we're going to learn anything new. If you haven't driven it, just go down to the 91 and you can ride on it, and there's your demonstration. But the question I have is, you want to reduce congestion, I think that's the objective. This is the purpose of the project. So congestion results when demand is higher than supply. So the way to eliminate or reduce congestion is increase supply or reduce demand. What is the objective of this project in order to reduce congestion? Is it to increase demand or reduce supply or both?
But you know, in engineering, effective capacity of a roadway varies a lot. So that's the non-intuitive part, is that in a sense, the effective supply is increased if you don't allow people to all crowd on at the same time, so that you're able to have higher levels of throughput. And that is just not an intuitive idea. So in a sense, you can be doing both.
I think there are some other unique aspects of these two corridors from the 91, because you're right, tolling is not new, hot lanes are not new. But for the 110, the Harbor Transit Way, we're trying it in an area where we've got 2 hot lanes pretty much in each direction, but it's a 2+ requirement in terms of tolling. We also want to see the improved transit service on those lines, on the freeways. And on the 10 freeway, we've got 3+ during the peak period, and it goes down to 2+ during the off-peak period. So that will be another opportunity to demonstrate how well hot lanes work in that type of environment. So there's some unique characteristics. We don't have a single chute kind of facility like the 91. We've got intermediate access points along the Harbor Transit Way that we'll be testing. So for each quarter, it's unique, and we've taken pains to try to explain to the community that while congestion pricing is not new throughout the nation, actually internationally, we want to customize it and tailor it for LA County. So we hope to learn something and be able to share it with everyone else as well.
And the second part, are you going to increase capacity or reduce demand?
Well, I think, as Brian mentioned, it's a little bit of both. For the 10 freeway, we have an opportunity. The El Monte Busway from the 605 to Alameda Street is 1 lane in each direction. But between the 605 and the 710, we've got a buffer that we're going to restripe and open up as a second hot lane for that 9-mile length. So that's really brand new capacity. For the 110, as many of you know, traveling northbound, Adams is basically, it stops at Adams. So we're making improvements at the off-ramp at Adams. We're also adding an additional turning lane off of Adams Boulevard to try to improve some throughput that way. But again, the other ways we're trying to get a capacity is by offering higher quality transit service. On the 110, we hope to encourage people to actually share the ride, either carpooling, vanpooling, or in this express bus, because we're offering a higher quality bus service as well at the same time.
On the 405, you're adding a lane for the small pass. That's costing you about $1 billion per lane mile. You're not expecting to generate that kind of revenue to add a lane on the 110.
$1 billion
That's
per
correct.
lane mile?
Not at all.
Million.
Okay, I think we've gone a little bit past our limit, but the questions were so interesting. I hope, Richard, this is okay with you. Let's thank the panel members. And